Great. So I don't know about you, but I've been spending a lot more time this year reading due to the quarantine and the pandemic, of course. And one book that I picked up was recommended to me. It's called The Design of Everyday Things. It was originally written in 1988, but it's been reissued and redone. But it's a really good look at the design of, as it says, everyday things. And it has a lot of applicability to designing software and the way in which users interact with software systems and similar objects. So I'm going to draw from some of the inspiration from that book in my talk today, and I'm going to walk through things that are particularly relevant for graph visualization. So first up, huge data, working with huge data volumes and some techniques for using our products for that. Then moving on to building your visual data model and some tips on doing that, before finally talking about some design when it comes to the user interface, making sure that that's a reasonable approach as well. So anyone who's really tried doing a graph visualization project or building an application will be familiar with these views. They're affectionately or pejoratively called hairballs. On the left-hand side here, we have quite a big blob there. This is, I believe that one is cycle routes across Boston, whereas on the right, we have airline routes across North America. There's lots of problems with these views. Firstly, they're overwhelming. On the left-hand side, there's lots of nodes and links. It's all very, very complicated. I can see that maybe everything's connected, but generally speaking, I can't really get that much from that view. And on the right, the colors make things even worse. It just makes it more into like a ball of yarn or something. I can spot there maybe some outliers, some things that are maybe less connected, but overall, this isn't too helpful. So this leads into probably the biggest takeaway from the book, which is that design should be user-centric. This may seem a little obvious, but Don Norman really kind of spearheaded this idea, taking it from human centricity to user centricity. And what this means is when we're designing applications, we should think about what our users are going to be trying to do with those systems, and what they're going to be trying to get out of the system and how they're going to interact with the system. So to do that, instead of starting with something like this, it's much more reasonable to say, let's drill down into something that's a bit more manageable. So one technique for doing that is using something that we call combos. We've talked about it a lot today. But what it means is we can take a network like this, which is, it's not too big, but it could be larger if we're using the full data source. And we can go from that, and we can actually start with a view that's a lot more summarized and a lot more easy to understand. And users who aren't familiar with graph visualization will find this much easier to drill down to the actual nodes that they're interested in visualizing and looking into in more detail. You can see there we go all the way down from regions of the world to countries and then to the actual individuals there at the bottom. And these are hierarchies that people are very familiar with and very comfortable with using. This example is similar, but it's subtly different in that we're not actually returning data from the database until we double click on each of those combos. So this is a really nice tip for reducing the amount of data sent over the wire to the browser, but also just making it so that it's with a nice loading mention there. It shows you that the system is behaving as expected, and it's going to be returning back more information as it comes to the system. Another approach would be to take our original hairball here, this one for those flight routes. Do you remember flying? It's been a while for me. And instead of starting with this large amount of data, what we could do is start with a filtering panel. So here we've used those categories that are intrinsic to those routes, those different colors for different airlines. And we are enabling users to start with 0 nodes on the screen. And if I click one of these buttons, we'll actually bring in more information. We'll bring in those airlines routes into the view. Now, one thing you may spot here, that there's no select all option. And you think that would be useful, right? Because if it's going to be starting like this and there's not going to be any boxes ticked, clearly if I want to show everything, I would like an option to do that. It actually turns out if we take away that option, it's conforming to something that I learned about this year. I think it's really fascinating. It's originally a Japanese term, poker yoke. It's a funny term, but what it effectively means is building systems so that they're error-proof themselves. So instead of saying, well, the system broke because you clicked that button, so it's your fault. Instead, we say, well, let's make it so no one can ever click that button. In this example, we're clearly not preventing someone from clicking each of those individual buttons. So it's not forcing people not to do that, which may be a decision that you want to make with your application. But I think thinking about things from a user-centric perspective and going from whether something is error-proof is a really nice way to think about building your graph applications. So here I've selected just 4 of those, and you see that my chart is a lot more reasonable, and I can start to spot things like people at the edge of the network, locations at the edge of the network, some of the hubs in the middle there. We see Dallas, Fort Worth right in the middle of the network. We're using color keys there. I'll come back to that a little later with the visual modeling I'll be talking about. But the colors are really helpful to spot those familiar colors for those different airlines. You can also see that we have a dynamic slider as well. So it's nice that our products allow you to do very dynamic visualizations. So as I slide that back and forth, I can reduce the number of routes shown on the screen depending on how popular or how common they are. Another great way to use filtering and something that's very dear to our hearts nowadays, especially with our additional chronograph functionality, is to select a time range. Here on the left-hand side, you see the time bar with our histogram view, and that breakdown of timestamps can be edited, and I can move the sliders left and right to change the way my chart looks based on my current time range. And we're a component, so you can use other additional components to help drive this. There we have a calendar picker for wider dates. And this is a really nice practice for allowing people to actually select or to even type dates in to choose this time bar range. I did a presentation yesterday with all two of our products, Regraph and Chronograph here. And one approach I took is to actually use the time bar at the bottom of the screen as a sort of query engine for the overall corpus of data. This is also attached to the date range I'm choosing on the right-hand side of the screen here, so it's my date pickers. And then a separate time view with Chronograph on the right-hand side, showing just the data in that range from the bottom of the screen. This is just a quick idea for me. I think it has some promise, and you'd really want to make sure that the users understand exactly which of these time components are referring to which data. But I thought this was quite a compelling example. On the same topic of working with huge data, oftentimes you have a large network like this. This is actually, again, isn't really that big, but you can imagine that a network of movies with actors in them could actually be a lot larger than this. A really common practice is to do a sort of, I like to call it land and expand. And that typically would be using some sort of search box. So I'm going to search for a person, search for a movie, and that is going to return back the results to my view, as you saw some of the presentations today. In the book, as I call it, this is known as an affordance. The interface is affording us the ability to bring in additional information. It's nice to give names for things so you can see how you're building things like affordances into your application. And so this is a great example of an affordance. So once I search for a movie or even double click on a node, I can see all of the movies and individuals who are connected to those movies, as you can see on the animation on the left there. So that's a really nice practice to use in your application to allow people to expand into that. Now, John kind of stole my thunder earlier in that this is already something that they're using at Dragos, where a really great practice is to actually say, if you're returning way too much data from the database and it's going to slow down your application because really it's not really that helpful to show all that data on the screen at once, here we've implemented a cap to say, actually, let's just fetch the top 10, or even prompt people if they really do want to load all the data they can. But generally, let's fetch the top 10 and load those into the view, just to kind of give that indication that something's happening. This may seem familiar. This is another great example of poker yoke. I'm preventing people from loading all the data into the screen. And in my application, I'd probably go the nuclear option and say, you can't fetch all. Literally, it's not going to help you. So I don't want to get you into that state. So that was the huge data piece. I'm going to move on now to the visual data model. If you've seen my talks before, I talk about this an awful lot. There's a lot of scope for talking and thinking about how you derive your visual data model. First up, colors. So colors are really commonly used to differentiate different nodes, and it's a great way to make your application look consistent with maybe the rest of your platform, with your branding, your company's branding, your company's color scheme, but also just a fancy way of making things look a little bit smarter, a little bit different when you look at different nodes on the screen. This is dummy data for an insurance claim, but without a legend, I don't know that. A user who's not familiar with this view would see this and question what exactly the black node is or what the green node is. So for that reason, I much prefer using things like icons. These are pretty much, you can't confuse what these icons are. We see cars, we see people, we see houses, and these are a really nice way of showing that information just heads up when you first look at your network. Of course, it doesn't prevent you from using colors as well. So that's another way that you can differentiate these nodes. So maybe this person is a person of interest. So let's color them red, and I can easily spot them different to the rest of the network. Back to the colors. Here I'm using the colors from actual companies. So we're familiar with the Twitter blue. It's very similar to another blue. I can't think of what that might be. And then also the Facebook blue. It's very simple for users to spot that these are things they're familiar with and things that they're kind of brands and identities that they know what they're looking at. I always talk about trust. You want your users to understand and trust that what they're showing is a realistic representation of the real world. The other thing that's really common when thinking about the visual data model is that you should actually reduce down the model compared to what you have in your backend database. There were some mentions today, I believe it was on the first talk, where the backend is really forcing you to do a certain sort of visualization on the front end. And that's effectively what's happening here. This is patients and doctors connected via appointments. And just because my database has each of those kind of concepts doesn't mean that that is what I should be showing in my front end. Back to being user-centric, it's really important that I think, well, actually, I don't care to see the individual appointments. Let's actually just look at the individuals and the doctors they're talking to, because that's probably going to be more helpful to my users. So if we were to do that, it would look something like this. So instead of having all those appointments, we can just see those links between each of the individuals that we care about looking at. That's quite a large example. So let me show you a little bit more of a kind of dummy example here. Really, this will give you an idea of the benefit of doing this sort of modeling with your visual data. So here we have another insurance network. We can see those icons showing off exactly who these people are, and we can see their labels with their names. But actually, I might want to collapse that down using that modeling. This is using something called projection. It's kind of just a fancy word of saying let's just kind of massage the data, massage the graph to show me something that's useful to my end users. And we see now that actually there's a shared phone number and a shared address for these two people. And that actually isn't too obvious when you're thinking about large networks with that sort of misdirection of having a node between those two individuals. We're using glyphs here on the links here, which is a nice way to summarize those nodes themselves. And I think even toggling between these two is something that you may want to consider in your application to really help people understand what they're looking at. And just one step further, we can use these with combos as well. So we're combining these individuals, and you can see the combined version has those nice summary links between them with those glyphs as well. So that's really nice. My final section is on user interface design. One other great thing I learned from this book is all about what is known as Featuritis, or creeping featurism. It's really, and we have lots of product people on the line, so they're probably very familiar with this. It's really tempting to add new features, new functionality. You have a customer who says, hey, we are dying for this feature. We really want this feature and we need it right now. And if it's just a flag, if it's something that you think you could add to an API, then it feels like you maybe want to just let them have it, right? You really need to think about the complexity that happens when you start to add features into your application. As you can read there, if you add 10 times as many features, the actual complexity that brings to your application is a lot larger than that. And that hits you on testing, it hits you on the user interface with people trying to understand how they're using the system. And it's just very painful. So I'm a big fan of promoting very minimal UI, very intuitive user interfaces. And I'll walk through some of the ideas behind that now. So first up, this is a really nice example where actually it's probably a little too simple for the real world, but it's a very simple interface where we're choosing that projection I showed you before, and we're choosing the different views depending on what I'm selecting on the right-hand side there. So we're projecting across the different types of networks depending on what we think our users want to see. In reality, different personas may be limited to certain views here, but yeah, just having a simple drop-down to choose between those is a nice approach. Now, there's always going to be secondary information that you want to show. And you should really take care to not show all this all at once, because it's going to be overwhelming and it's likely to be cluttering up your view and make things hard to understand. So I'm a big fan of using very intuitive interactivity. I'm not saying you should have things like double click, then right click, then right click to drag. You should be thinking about clicks, double clicks, and that's basically it, really. Even context menus aren't particularly discoverable. But yeah, those should be bringing the secondary information on demand. So in these examples, we have some donuts being shown there when I click on nodes, as well as some other factors there as well, like the longer label as well. Now, foregrounding is something that's in both keylines and regraph, and it's a really great way of showing off a subset of the network without losing the context of the wider network. So here we have certain nodes that are highlighted in the foreground, and the rest of the nodes are backgrounded. One tip is you can actually specify the alpha or the transparency of those background nodes as well. So that's an option in the products. But the benefit of this is that we have a network like this, and if you think about how you look at this network, your intuition is actually to pick up on the connections and to directly look at the neighbors on the view there. That's the sort of mental task that you're doing when you look at this network. Like I'm seeing this person here, or rather this gene, and I can see just quickly all the direct neighbors of that node there on the view. So why not lean into that? On selection, ideally, I'd love to be able to see the direct neighbors of those nodes. Let's make that task even easier. And a very intuitive thing is just to click on a node, which is something that you should be promoting in your application. And as a result, you can see the direct neighbors of that node. And we're also shift clicking there, so you can see the relative common paths between those two nodes, which is nice as well. I add this to all my applications because I think it's something that people understand and appreciate when they're looking at networks. Finally, almost finally, we want our user interfaces to be intuitive. From before, we saw that our expansions is possible using double clicks or maybe search boxes. But if I look at this little network here, it's not clear to me whether I actually have data for all of the nodes on the screen. This is another thing in the book. We can actually give our users the understanding of the affordance we're allowing them by providing a signifier. In this case, the signifier will be these little pluses on those nodes. Immediately now, it's signifying to me that I can do something with these nodes, and this is where my double click comes in. A double click is intuitive to me using a computer, so I can now double click on those nodes and do the expansions. So yeah, this is a great way to signify some of those affordances that your application are allowing, and they make a big difference when you're thinking about how your users use your system. And then my final piece is just down to visual feedback. Users do not like to feel that the system has paused or is clogging up their browser. Fortunately, that's very much an uncommon situation with our products. But of course, there are sometimes pieces that will take some time to load or maybe time to process. Using process bars like this on the bottom right here, or this nice sort of ticker on the top of this view here, it's a great way to say, hold on, we're just doing something, we'll be back with you in a second. So this is really important to keep that really intuitive. Animations are really important as well. You do not want to overuse these, but these are a good way of showing that something is happening, something is in progress, and it's actually traceable as well. So I'm tracing how this is changing on the screen, and I can understand how I got from the previous state to my next state. So this is something that you should really take care of when you're thinking about your interfaces. So those are my 3 key sections. Thanks so much for your time today. I'd love to have any questions that you have for me. I know we're running low on time. This was the home stretch. Really appreciate any feedback you have, any sort of tips that you maybe have for us. You're the ones using our tooling in production, so we're always happy to hear about that. But thanks again for your time, and I'll see you soon.